I did not expect a single question to redraw the borders of my life. Yet there, I was a 62-year-old widow, standing in my daughter's spotless kitchen, discovering how quickly love can turn into something colder than indifference. I had buried my husband 3 years earlier and rebuilt my days around the last person I believed was certain my daughter Lucille. When I asked to borrow $100 until my Social Security payment arrived next week, she looked at me as if I'd tracked mud across her perfect floors, and a word I never imagined hearing from my own child cut the room in two leech. Lucille wore her banker's uniform like armor hair drawn into a severe bun that tugged her expression tight. She set down her mug with a hard clink and recited a ledger of resentments. I lived there rent-free, ate food I did not buy, used water and electricity I did not pay for. Her voice rose, and I pictured the neighbor's curtains stirring. She was 35, successful by all outward measures, a teller who had climbed into management through precision and brisk competence. Yet the girl I had soothed through midnight fevers and clothed with double-shift wages had become a woman who believed compassion was an overdraft fee. "If you want money, go get a job," she said, and the final word she chose came in Spanish, sharp as broken glass. I stood still for a long moment, not because I was stunned, but because something else had awakened something I had misplaced while grieving my husband, my spine. Upstairs in the small room that used to be her playroom, my room for these last difficult years, I sat on the bed and studied the woman in the mirror. I looked older than my age, yes, but also smaller, as if living inside my daughter's house had whittled me down to something convenient to overlook. I opened Harold's old leather briefcase and removed documents I had not touched since the funeral investment portfolio's property deeds a letter in his tidy hand. "My dearest Edna," it began, and the paper trembled as I read it again. Harold had been an unshowy genius with numbers, a man who believed true wealth was best hidden under modesty. "We lived simply by choice," he wrote. "Now it is all yours." He had left me $260 million he accrued through decades of investments and a quiet share in a tech company from the early days of Silicon Valley. We had driven used cars, clipped coupons, and said no to extravagance, not because we had to, but because we wanted to keep our values from wandering off. I had never told Lucille about the money. Grief made arithmetic heavier than granite, and our longtime advisor, Robert Jennings, took the helm while I kept my life small. I took little, saved much, and observed my daughter the way a mother learns to watch an adult child carefully, kindly, hopefully. Harold had a saying, "The true test of character is how people treat you when they think you have nothing to offer." Lucille's test had arrived over $100, and the result stripped the sugar from the air. At 9 p.m., I called Robert. He answered on the first ring, a steady voice I'd trusted for 20 years. "I need to make arrangements tomorrow," I said. "Large transfers." He asked the amount. I said all of it. He hesitated the way a good steward does, then agreed to meet me at First National at 10 a.m. "Isn't that where Lucille works?" he asked gently. "It is," I said, and we both let the rest remain unsaid. That night, the house thrummed with Lucille's self-assurance, her grandfather clock ticking like a metronome for ambition, her stainless steel appliances humming their wealthy lullaby. I walked through the rooms and saw how much of it I had quietly funded after Harold's death, not from the vast fortune I had protected, but from the modest insurance payout I had placed in her hands when the world first felt tilted. The scent of her expensive perfume lingered in the hall like a boast. I returned to my room, packed the documents, and slept the kind of sleep that comes only after a decision has stitched itself shut. Morning arrived in a halo of ordinary light. I wore my best navy dress and carried Harold's briefcase like a bridge to steadier ground. 10 minutes before 10 a.m., I stepped through the bank's heavy glass doors and saw Lucille behind the teller counter, smiling professionally at an elderly man counting out crumpled bills. Robert waited near the private offices with a stack of paperwork bound by sober clips. He asked once more if I was certain. I told him certainty was the first useful thing I'd felt in 3 years. In a quiet room with a frosted window and a tasteful plant, we liquidated positions that had slept through market storms and consolidated funds that had grown under Harold's disciplined patience. What could have felt like erasure instead felt like clarity. I authorized transfers with a steady hand, most of the fortune to organizations Harold and I had long admired, and supported privately the remainder to a set of personal accounts that would let me live modestly independently and without apology. By noon, it was done. The numbers that had once lived like secrets now had destinations aligned with the values that created them. When I stepped back into the lobby, Lucille was finishing with another customer. She looked up, saw me, and her mouth tightened the way it had in the kitchen. She motioned me forward without a smile. "Mom, I'm at work," she said in a low voice, as if my presence were a policy violation. "If this is about money," I set the withdrawal slip on the counter, written carefully in my neat hand. She glanced, frowned, and then really looked. Color drained from her face. Her fingers shook on the keyboard as she pulled up my account. I watched a series of expressions flicker across her features: annoyance, confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning calculation that chilled me. "This says," her voice thinned, "this says you had 264 million and change." I met her eyes, calm as the marble underfoot. "Your father was very successful. We chose to live simply." She swallowed. "You're a millionaire." "I was," I said. "Not anymore." Lucille's lips parted, but no words emerged. She looked from the screen to my face and back again, as if repetition might force the numbers to confess a trick. When her breath returned, it came in quick, shallow pulls. "This can't be right," she whispered, then louder for the benefit of the tellers beside her. "There must be an error." She flagged a supervisor with a clipped wave. The branch manager, a man named James Wheeler, who wore an expensive watch and a careful smile, stepped over. Lucille spoke fast, the words tumbling in a tangle of authority and panic. "My mother's account shows hundreds of millions. She's trying to move money. I think she's confused, maybe scammed." The manager turned to me with a polished concern that only intensified the embarrassment prickling my skin. I kept my voice even. "The transaction you're seeing has already been executed in a private office with my advisor, who has known our family for 2 decades. I am competent. The funds are now where I intended them to be." James Wheeler absorbed this without blinking. He glanced at the screen, then at Lucille, whose composure was unraveling thread by thread. "Of course," he said, and shifted into the bank's neutral tone. "If there's anything else you need, Mrs. Morrison, we're here." Lucille stepped out from behind the counter, the click of her heels too sharp for the hushed lobby. "Mom, please," she hissed, abandoning the cool professionalism that had always been her safest cloak. "We need to talk." She reached for my arm. I let her fingers rest there without resisting, then gently removed them, like setting down something fragile that no longer belongs to you. In a moment, I said, "There is nothing left to discuss in this building." Outside, the air felt lighter, as if the glass doors had sifted out the noise. Lucille followed me onto the sidewalk, the shape of panic now plain on her face. "You can't do this," she said. "You can't just give away." She stopped herself, as if naming the amount might make it vanish for a second time. "You are upset," I told her. "I understand. But I am not. I have done exactly what your father would have recognized as right." Her voice thinned. "Right would have been telling me. We're family. The word buckled under its own weight. Yesterday, family sounded like an invoice, I said. Today, it sounds like a lock. I prefer keys. By 12 p.m., I was in my car. Lucille burst through the doors and hurried toward me, hair slipping from the severe bun she wore like a command. Please don't leave. The plea was real. The reason for it was not. I rolled down the window. I'll be home by 12:30 p.m. I suggest we each take a breath before we speak again. She nodded, too quickly, relief and calculation elbowing each other behind her eyes. Back at the house, she was already pacing the porch. Inside, her tone swung towards sweetness. The syrup poured too fast. I've been thinking, she said, following me into the kitchen. I was stressed yesterday. I said cruel things. I'm sorry. I want to fix this. I set my purse down and waited. People show you who they are if you can bear to watch a few more seconds than is comfortable. You moved the money, she continued, but transfers can be reversed. Fraud departments exist for a reason. We can file a report. If anyone pressured you? No one pressured me, I said. I made choices aligned with Harold's values and mine. Most of the funds are now in the hands of organizations that shelter families, treat children, and teach adults to read. Enough remains for me to live without intruding on anyone else's peace. The word intruding sharpened her posture. So you're moving out? Yes. I let the answer hang until it stopped echoing. I've signed a lease across town, a small apartment with morning light in the kitchen and a steady breeze on the balcony. She blinked. When? By the end of the week. Her laugh came brittle and bright, the sound of glassware chiming in an empty room. Over one argument, over a pattern, I said. Yesterday was not a weather event. It was climate. For the rest of the day, her apologies came like summer storms, loud, brief, and quickly replaced by humidity. At 6 p.m., she circled back to numbers, speaking about taxes and penalties, about responsibility and legacy, and the wisdom of diversified holdings. I listened, then told her what legacy means to me, the shape a person's kindness makes on the room after they leave it. By 8 p.m., her words had thinned to a different strategy, one I recognized from childhood tantrums bargaining. A weekend trip together, she proposed time to reset. I told her I had plans to rest, not reset. The next morning, she shifted again, coffee placed outside my door at 7 a.m. A folded note that said she loved me, a second note at 11 a.m., reminding me how lonely it can be to grow old alone. I packed in quiet, folding Harold's sweaters the way he used to fold affection, without fanfare, with care. In the afternoon, she hovered in the doorway and watched me slide framed photographs into a box. Do you remember the summer at the lake when I caught 2 fish? She asked, reaching for nostalgia, as if it were a ladder to climb out of consequence. I do, I said. Your father taught you to catch and release. She smiled, relieved to have tugged a memory that didn't sting, but the smile faded when I added, he taught you the part after the catch was the point. On the third day, she sat on the edge of my bed with swollen eyes and a tissue shredded to lace. I've been thinking about Dad, she said. He'd be devastated by all this. I placed the last sweater in the suitcase and closed it with a soft click. He would be devastated by the contempt that started it, I said. He believed money was a tool. He believed people were the work. I carried the suitcase downstairs, while Lucille followed, no longer masking the desperation that pulsed beneath her skin. What happens now? She asked at the door, her voice small. I set the suitcase down and looked at her. Really looked at the child I loved and the adult I needed to protect myself from. Now you get what you asked for, I said gently. Your life back. I lifted the suitcase, stepped into the afternoon, and felt the weight of it rearrange itself in my hand, like something choosing to be lighter. The first week in my new apartment felt like stepping into a space designed for breathing. It was small. Yes, 2 modest rooms and a balcony that overlooked a line of oak trees, but it was mine. The morning light streamed across the kitchen table at 7 a.m., painting my coffee cup in gold. No footsteps hurried overhead. No sharp voices cut the quiet. The silence was not emptiness, it was peace. I unpacked, slowly choosing which parts of my past deserved to travel with me. Harold's wedding photograph, my mother's teacups, the quilt I had stitched when Lucille was a girl. The rest I left in boxes, reminders of a life too heavy to carry forward. By Thursday evening, I had neighbors. Betty and Frank lived next door, a retired couple whose warmth felt unpracticed, genuine. They knocked with a casserole balanced between them, insisting that no one should eat alone their first week. Over that dinner, laughter rose in the little apartment like bread in the oven, and I realized how long it had been since I had laughed without calculation. Soon, it became a rhythm. Tuesday dinners, Saturday morning, walks, a sense of community that asked nothing more of me than presence. Lucille called daily at first. Sometimes I answered. More often, I let the phone ring. The voicemails varied, anger that curdled into guilt that stiffened into pleading. "You embarrassed me at work. You destroyed our family. I didn't mean it, Mom, please call me." Each message was a different costume stitched over the same desperation. What none of them included was the one thing I longed to hear: recognition of how her words had wounded me. One evening, as the sun bruised the sky, Pink Betty mentioned seeing Lucille at the grocery store. "She looked worn," Betty said carefully. "Asked about you. I told her you were doing well." I nodded, grateful and heavy. Doing well was true. Happy was truer. Yet beneath the gratitude, there was a hollow where longing used to live, the longing for my daughter to see me as more than a ledger line. 6 weeks after I moved out, Lucille arrived at my building unannounced. I found her standing by the mailbox, mascara smudged, holding a bouquet of lilies. "I thought maybe we could start over," she said, voice wobbling between sincerity and strategy. I let her inside, offered tea, and listened as she spun a story about therapy, about learning to manage her stress, about missing her mother. For a moment, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that beneath the banker's bun and the sharp words was still the little girl who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. But when she reached the end of her practiced confession, her eyes darted not to me, but to the leather briefcase on the shelf. She asked almost casually where the money had gone. I set my teacup down gently. "The money went where it could do good. Hospitals, shelters, literacy centers." Her jaw clenched. "All of it, all but enough to live independently." She looked at me, then really looked, and I saw fury braided with grief. "So you punished me?" she said. "No, I freed myself." She left in a storm of perfume and slammed doors, but the quiet that followed did not sting. It soothed. For the first time in years, I understood that letting go of someone can be an act of love, not for them, but for yourself. Months passed. I built a rhythm of purpose. I began volunteering twice a week at the literacy center downtown, teaching adults to read. Their eyes lit up when letters formed into words, when words unlocked stories, when stories gave them back pieces of their lives. They called me patient, kind, useful. Useful. It had been years since I had felt that word wrap itself around me like a shawl. Lucille's calls dwindled to once a week, then once a month. The last message I saved was softer than the rest. "I know you probably won't call back," she said, "but I'm trying to change. I miss you." Her voice cracked in the middle, but even then I heard it, the hunger not for connection, but for what connection might grant her. I deleted the message, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. One crisp autumn morning, I visited Harold's grave. The wind rattled through the oak leaves overhead, scattering shadows across the grass. I laid fresh flowers and whispered updates the way I always did. "I gave most of your money away," I told him. "Kept just enough. I'm teaching again, in a way. helping adults find their voices through words. I matter, Harold. After all this time, I matter again. As I spoke, I realized something startling. Lucille had given me a gift in her cruelty. If she had smiled and handed me the $100 that morning, I might have stayed in her house forever, shrinking into the corners, convincing myself her indifference was just her nature. Instead, she had shown me the truth, and the truth had set me free. That night, I stood on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the lights wink on in the neighboring apartments. Laughter drifted from Betty and Frank's window. Across the street, children played chase until their parents called them in. My phone rang once, then fell silent. I turned it face down on the table. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for anyone's approval. I was simply living. Winter folded over the city in a hush of frost and silver mornings. In my apartment, the radiator hissed softly, and the smell of stew simmered on the stove gave the place a kind of homemade gravity. By then, 6 months had passed since I had walked out of Lucille's house with a suitcase and Harold's briefcase. The ache of that decision had dulled into something steadier, like an old scar that no longer hurts but never quite disappears. I kept busy. Tuesdays and Thursdays at the Literacy Center filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my seamstress days when my work had clothed people and carried them forward in the world. Now my students, men and women who had been told too often they were too old or too slow, sat across from me with trembling fingers and hopeful eyes. When they read their first sentence aloud, the joy in their voices lit a warmth in me that no amount of money could purchase. After class, I often lingered with them for coffee, laughing over small stories, sharing recipes, exchanging advice. These friendships were different from family, but in some ways sturdier. At home, Betty and Frank had become constants in my days. On Friday evenings, we played cards at their kitchen table, the air filled with the smell of Frank's pipe tobacco and Betty's laughter that bubbled up without warning. They asked nothing of me but presence, never calculating, never weighing what I could provide. "You make this building feel alive," Betty told me once, patting my hand. I squeezed hers and realized she had given me something Lucille never had, the feeling of being cherished without conditions. Lucille, meanwhile, orbited my life like a restless comet. Her calls arrived less often, but still carried the same twin threads of guilt and need. Sometimes she apologized for the word she had hurled at me, sanguisuga, bloodsucker, but even her apologies were framed like transactions. I shouldn't have said that she'd admit. "If I take you to dinner, will you forgive me?" She spoke as if kindness could be bought in installments. I listened sometimes, but more often let the machine collect her voice. Each time, I felt both the pull of maternal love and the shield of self-respect I had worked so hard to build. One afternoon in January, I returned from the market to find Lucille waiting outside my building, again coat-buttoned, against the cold eyes rimmed with red. She followed me up the stairs with a cascade of words, therapy sessions, progress, regret, a promise that she was learning how to be better. I brewed tea and let her sit at the table, let her spill the performance she had rehearsed. She spoke about missing me, about how lonely the house felt without my presence. For a fleeting moment, I almost softened. But then her eyes drifted again to the shelf where Harold's briefcase rested, the same briefcase she had seen at the bank. "I just wish you'd trusted me with the money," she murmured. The words snapped the string that held my sympathy. She didn't say she wished I trusted her with my heart, or my fears, or my grief, only the money. I stood, collected the teacups, and told her gently but firmly that it was time to go. She left with a sharp breath and a slammed door. I didn't cry. I simply sat at the window afterward, watching the snowflakes whirl, and whispered to myself the truth I had finally accepted. Some relationships are too fractured to mend, not because of one argument, but because of a foundation built on selfishness instead of care. The weeks that followed brought new rhythms. I started hosting Sunday suppers for neighbors, filling my apartment with the aroma of roasted chicken, the clink of dishes, the murmur of gratitude. People lingered late into the evening, reluctant to leave the warmth of the gathering. In those moments, I felt Harold beside me again, his hand at the small of my back, proud that I had built a life worth inhabiting. Spring returned with soft breezes through the oak trees. At the cemetery, I knelt beside Harold's stone and told him everything. How Lucille still called but hadn't changed. How I had found family in Betty and Frank, in the students who now read books with pride, in the neighbors who trusted me with their laughter. I told him I was happy, truly happy, for the first time since he left. "She thinks I punished her," I whispered. "But really, I set myself free." The wind stirred the grass, and in that rustle, I imagined his answer simple and approving. By summer, I no longer flinched when the phone rang. Sometimes I answered, sometimes not. But my peace no longer depended on whether Lucille softened or hardened, apologized or accused. I had given her the gift of truth that cruelty has consequences, and love without respect is only obligation disguised. Whether she ever accepted that lesson was no longer my responsibility. Summer settled in with long evenings that stretched golden across my small apartment. I had grown into a life that felt simple, yet full, the kind of existence Harold would have recognized as true wealth. My balcony bloomed with pots of herbs, the air inside smelled often of bread cooling on the counter, and my phone held more numbers of new friends than old regrets. Every week at the Literacy Center, I watched adults find their voices in the pages of children's books, the sentences halting at first, then flowing with the confidence of people reclaiming their dignity. Their progress mirrored my own. I, too, had learned to read my life differently, line by line, with new meaning between the words. Lucille's voice still drifted into my world from time to time. The calls grew less frequent, but carried the same uneasy mixture of apology and self-interest. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she promised that therapy was teaching her to change. Sometimes she spoke of being overwhelmed with work. Yet never once did she acknowledge what had broken us, the contempt that spilled from her lips when she believed I had nothing to give. She mourned the money more than she mourned the wound. And so I let her messages collect like old receipts, proof of a transaction I had no wish to revisit. One evening, Betty and Frank invited me to their anniversary dinner. As we clinked glasses under strings of lights in their cozy dining room, Betty leaned across the table and whispered, "You've brought joy back into this building, Edna. You're family to us now." My eyes stung with tears, not of sadness, but of recognition. Family, I realized, is not always blood. Sometimes it is chosen. Sometimes it is found in the quiet kindness of people who see your worth without needing to measure it. 6 months after I had left Lucille's house, she tried again. A voicemail arrived late at night, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Mom, it's me. I know you probably won't call back, but I wanted you to know I've been thinking about everything. My therapist says I struggle with boundaries and emotional expression. I don't want to lose you. Could we meet for coffee?" I listened once, then pressed delete. Not in anger, but in clarity. Healing does not mean returning to what broke you. On a crisp autumn morning, I drove to the cemetery. Kneeling at Harold's grave, I told him everything I had learned. "The money is gone, Harold," I said softly. "To hospitals, to shelters, to schools, to places where it can breathe life instead of gathering dust. I kept enough to live simply like we always wanted. I'm happy now. Truly happy. I matter again." The wind rattled the oak leaves overhead, and I felt his approval in the quiet rustle. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sky melt into shades of violet and gold. I thought back to the morning I had asked Lucille for $100. What I believed was a test had in truth been a mirror. She had shown me who she was without wealth to soften her edges, and in showing me, she had freed me. If she had handed me the money with a smile, I might still be in her house, shrinking smaller each day, convincing myself scraps were enough. Instead, her cruelty had returned me to myself. As darkness folded in, I understood that revenge was never the point. The sweetest outcome was not her regret or her frantic calls, but my own peace. I had built a life filled with purpose, surrounded by laughter and warmth, guided by dignity. Lucille believed she had lost a fortune, but what she had truly lost was a mother who would have loved her without condition. And what I had gained was beyond any sum, the knowledge that I am worthy of respect, of kindness, of love, freely given. If you've stayed with me through this story, I wonder what would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced a moment when someone revealed who they truly were, and you had to decide whether to stay or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share, so more people can join us in these journeys of strength and truth.